Curiosity drifted through the falling snow long before Elara Wynne appeared on the ridge, as if the winter wind itself were wondering why a lone woman dared stand at the edge of Hollow Creek with nothing but a worn satchel and a look that suggested she had run out of places to disappear into. She was 28, pretty in the soft, unassuming way of someone who had never been encouraged to believe it. Her boots were cracked, her shawl thin, and yet her posture held a quiet defiance, as though giving up would have been easier, but something stubborn within her refused to kneel to the cold. Every passerby that morning saw only a drifting stranger. But the truth was far more fragile. She had nowhere left to go, and she had already used up every scrap of courage she owned just to keep standing there. What little Elara possessed came from memories she wished she could forget. She had grown up believing silence was the safest armor. Speaking too loudly drew trouble, asking for comfort invited disappointment, and hoping for belonging led only to another slammed door. After her father died, the relatives who took her in treated her less like family and more like a chore. When they finally forced her out, she left with nothing but a locket and a determination so thin it almost snapped. Since then, each town had judged her before she had spoken a single word. Doors closed. Gossip spread. Whispers followed. And through it all, she held her breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to look at her without measuring what she lacked. But it was not a gentle welcome that brought Beckett Hale down the mountain that day. He had woken to the sharp bite of winter deepening across the tree-line, the kind of cold that makes even pines groan. At 34, he had lived most of his life with only the forest for company. People praised his steady hands and quiet strength, but they rarely understood how solitude had shaped him. The ranch he inherited from his father thrived, yet he seldom visited town except for supplies. Not because he disliked people, but because the noise scraped against something tender inside him. So when he saw the woman shivering by the road, he wasn't driven by pity or impulse. He simply recognized a loneliness that mirrored something familiar. Beckett slowed his horse, snow brushing across his shoulders as he approached. Elara stiffened, bracing herself for another dismissive glance or a sharp reminder that she didn't belong. But instead of riding past, Beckett dismounted and removed his hat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The gesture startled her. It was a courtesy men rarely offered her, as though she were undeserving of small dignities. His voice, when he spoke, was low and careful, shaped by the mountain's silence. "You look cold, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "The weather's turning bad. You need a warm place to rest." The question should have been simple. But Elara felt her throat tighten. Kindness had become a foreign language, one she feared misreading. She tried to answer, but the weight of days spent alone pressed too heavily against her voice. And in one unguarded moment, as if the truth had slipped past her defenses, she whispered the confession she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I've never been kissed." The word surprised even her, flung into the snow like something she no longer had the strength to hide. Beckett didn't laugh. He didn't recoil. He simply studied her the way he studied storms, quietly, attentively, as though searching for the meaning behind the trembling edges. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a kind of gentle regard that made her uncertain whether to stay or run. After a long moment, he lifted his hat slightly, his voice softening. "Then let's start slow." The sentence was simple, but Elara felt it settle inside her like warmth spreading through frostbitten fingers. For the first time in months, she did not feel invisible. Beckett offered his horse, steadying the reins while she climbed onto the saddle. She hesitated, the instinct to vanish tugging at her, but the sincerity in his expression anchored her. She accepted his help. As they rode toward his cabin, the snowfall thickened, turning the world into a quiet blur of white. Elara felt the weight of his coat settle across her shoulders, heavy, warm, unexpectedly comforting. No one had draped anything around her with care since childhood. She inhaled the faint scent of pine and saddle leather and felt the smallest fracture in her fear. Beckett noticed the way she kept her hands close, as though preparing to be pushed away. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he matched the horse's pace to her breathing, keeping the rhythm slow, giving her space to settle into the idea of safety. He wasn't a man of many words, but he understood the value of silence when it held kindness instead of judgment. And in that quiet, something fragile began to unfold. When they reached his cabin, Elara paused on the threshold. Warm lamplight spilled through the open door, a gentle glow that made her heart ache. Beckett didn't urge her inside. He simply waited, letting her decide if this moment would be another memory she fled from or the first step toward something new. She crossed the threshold. Inside, the space was modest but cared for. Clean tools hung precisely on the wall, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a wood stove crackling softly. It was not grand, but it felt lived in. Steady. Real. Beckett handed her a blanket, then turned away to give her privacy, the small gesture speaking more than words. She wrapped the wool around her shoulders, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. He cooked stew, moving quietly around the room, and Alara watched him with a cautious curiosity. Each motion he made carried intention but not urgency, like a man who had learned long ago that rushing only disturbs what matters. When he set a bowl in front of her, she murmured a thank you so faint it nearly vanished into the fire's crackle. As she ate, she studied the man who had found her on the ridge. He wasn't handsome in the polished way town men sometimes were. His beauty was quieter, broad shoulders softened by gentleness, calloused hands that somehow moved with care, eyes shaped by long winters and longer silences. She wondered what loneliness looked like in his life, and whether her presence stirred or soothed it. When she finished, Beckett guided her to the cot near the hearth. "Rest," he said softly. "You're safe here." His tone didn't command, it reassured. Alara lay down, still wrapped in the blanket, and felt the fire's warmth mingle with a sensation she hadn't felt in years. Safety that didn't demand anything in return. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the wilderness in a hush that felt almost protective. Inside, the cabin held a stillness that invited breathing again, thinking again, hoping again. And though the night offered rest, it also left a lingering question, one that would follow her into morning. What might happen if she allowed herself to stay? It wasn't an answer she had yet, but for the first time, Alara felt ready to search for one. Snow lingered for days around Beckett Hale's cabin, muffling the world into a quiet that felt almost protective. Inside those walls, Alara Wynne found small pieces of herself returning, pieces she had forgotten she ever owned. Yet comfort, she learned, was a delicate thing. It could settle easily but lift just as easily when doubt crept under the skin. Each morning she woke to the soft creak of floorboards as Beckett tended the stove, and each morning she wondered whether she had overstayed her welcome. Gratitude mixed with a fragile fear that the warmth she had found here was temporary, a kindness she might accidentally break. Beckett, meanwhile, watched her with a care he did not fully understand. He noticed how she kept her hands folded whenever she spoke, as if bracing for reproach. He noticed how she scanned the window before stepping outside, as though expecting trouble to ride up the trail at any moment. And he noticed, though he told no one, that his cabin felt larger with her there, as if her presence breathed a gentler rhythm into the home he had long assumed would remain silent. He had not invited her out of loneliness, but her arrival exposed how deeply solitude had settled into his bones. Despite the fragile peace between them, tension brewed beyond the pines. Hollow Creek was a town quick to gossip, and it did not take long for word of the mysterious woman living on Hale Mountain to ripple through its storefronts and porches. Alara knew how swiftly whispers sharpened into misjudgment. She had lived through the consequences of poorly told stories, and she feared this town would be no different. Even Beckett sensed the shift. Merchants who once greeted him with polite nods now exchanged glances when he entered, weighing rumors against his reputation. The unease reached a breaking point when Alara ventured into town alone for the first time, determined to repay Beckett's kindness by purchasing what little she could with the last coins in her satchel. The moment she stepped into the general store, conversation died as abruptly as a lamp blown out. A pair of women turned toward her, their expressions tight with suspicion. One whispered, not nearly quiet enough, "She's living off Hale's charity. Mark my words, nothing good comes of that." Alara tried to ignore them, but every comment struck like a draft through broken shutters. She bought flour and matches, keeping her eyes lowered, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But as she reached the counter, the older shopkeeper leaned forward, voice stern. "If you're stayin' up there, mind yourself," he warned. "Men like Hale got too much to lose, talkin' in strays." The word stung. Stray. It was not new, but hearing it spoken openly, as if her presence were a nuisance that needed purging, cut deeper than she expected. She mumbled a quiet thank you and fled, fighting the urge to hide her trembling hands. When she returned to the cabin, Beckett saw the shadows lingering behind her eyes before she spoke a single word. He asked what had happened, but she shook her head, insisting it was nothing. He did not push her. He simply stepped closer, offering silent reassurance, though she felt too ashamed to accept it. That evening, as the wind pressed against the windows, she lay awake long after Beckett had gone to bed, replaying the shopkeeper's words. She imagined Beckett losing respect, losing trust, losing peace because he had offered her shelter. The thought hollowed her from the inside. By morning, she had made a decision rooted in fear rather than reason. Before the sun rose, she packed her satchel with quiet efficiency, taking only what belonged to her. She paused at the hearth, where warmth flickered gently, and whispered a soft thank you meant for Beckett's sleeping form behind the closed door. Then she stepped into the cold, her breath unsteady, her resolve cracked but determined. She believed leaving was an act of protection, sparing him from the weight of her existence. Snow fell in slow spirals as she walked, each flake catching the faint morning light. Beckett discovered her absence only moments later. At first, he thought she might be gathering firewood. But then he noticed the missing blanket, the empty corner where her satchel had rested, the faint imprint of boots leading away from the cabin. His chest tightened with an urgency he had not felt in years. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his coat and followed the tracks through the snow. He knew the mountain paths better than most, but dread gnawed at him. Ilara was walking straight into deepening terrain, unaware of how quickly storms could turn treacherous. The sky darkened as Beckett hurried through the forest, calling her name into the cold air. Panic threatened to break through his steady composure. He had spent a lifetime losing things he loved to silence and time. He refused to lose her to fear. At last, near a bend where the trail dipped sharply, he spotted her figure slumped against a fallen pine. She wasn't unconscious, but exhaustion had stolen the strength from her limbs. "Ilara," he said, breathless as he reached her. She looked up with startled despair, as though expecting reproach. Instead, he knelt beside her, eyes fierce with worry. "Why did you leave?" Her reply came softly, trembling through the cold. "I didn't want to cause trouble. People talk. They think I'm using you. I thought leaving would protect you." Beckett shook his head, the gesture firm but tender. "You don't protect someone by vanishing. You protect them by staying honest. And you, Ilara Wynne, are not trouble." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight with steady arms. "Let me decide what I want. I want you safe. I want you home." The word home cracked something open inside her. And though fear still clung to her, she let him guide her back toward the cabin. By the time they reached it, snow had begun to settle softly across the porch, as though the world itself wished to welcome her return. Inside, Beckett wrapped her in blankets and knelt before her, his voice gentle. "You don't owe this place anything," he said. "But if you choose to stay, you won't face the world alone." Tears warmed her chilled cheeks as she met his gaze. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "Not anymore." He offered a small, hopeful smile. "Then stay." And for the first time in her life, the word stay felt like a promise, and a beginning.